Today, I want to talk about summertime spinnerbait fishing. A lot of times when we think about a spinnerbait, I think a lot of us associate it with springtime fishing or even colder water fishing. But the spinnerbait can be a very effective tool during the middle of summer to catch a lot of big fish. And today I want to talk about 3 specific patterns that I look for with the spinnerbait during summer. So let's dive on into it. The first pattern that I always look for is actually fishing a spinnerbait in off-color water, way up the river on a lake or way into major tributaries. If you fish on more natural lakes, sometimes even in natural lakes, you'll have creeks that feed those natural lakes, and getting up inside of those creeks in the dead of summer can be a really good way to catch bass on the spinnerbait. Now, one thing that you see a lot of times when you go up these creeks and in these rivers is you're gonna see one off-color water, which we already kind of talked about, and the other one is moving water. A lot of times you're going to have a slight current going through there, and that current, along with the off-color water, is going to keep fish shallow year-round. And this is a pattern that I actually see develop more later into summer. When you start getting into the end of July and into August and in September, when you have some of the hottest months of the year, a lot of the fish that are on kind of the main lake, the ones that guys have been catching offshore, tend to get a little bit hard to catch. And if you go way up these creek arms, you can actually throw a spinnerbait around a lot and catch a lot of big fish. Now, the big reason that these fish are even up in these creeks, again, is current, a little bit cooler water, and a lot of times you're going to have a ton of bait fish in these areas. A lot of young of the year shad, a lot of the young of the year bluegill all make their way into some of these small creeks. And a great way to mimic those little bait fish is with a spinnerbait. Now, something that I do a lot, especially when I'm in off-color water, is I will actually not use, we have willow leaf blades on this bait right here, but a lot of times when I get up into this off-color water, I'm gonna switch over to more Colorado style blades. These are ones that look more like a circle. They put off more vibration, which really allow bass to hone in on that spinnerbait. Now, anytime I do a spinnerbait video, a lot of guys ask me about red kicker blades, and that is something that I really reserve for kind of the springtime. If I'm fishing in the spring, I'll use those orange and red and pink kicker blades. But when I'm going up the river in the middle of summer, I actually tend to not use that red kicker blade. I'm not saying that you're not going to catch fish on it, but I just don't think it's necessary. I think during the spring, bass really like that color red, but in the summer, it's not as big of a deal. Those fish are feeding, again, a lot on bait fish. Now, the second pattern that I always look for is actually by targeting clear water flats. That's a really big key. Now, the big thing with these flats is typically you're gonna have a little bit of grass, maybe a little bit of rock, or maybe one or the other, especially grass flats. But anywhere you have these massive expanses, that's a big flat, those fish are gonna be pushing on those flats, kind of like dinner tables, to actually feed up on fish. Now, if you have largemouth or smallmouth, especially smallmouth, this is a phenomenal way to catch some really big fish. And what I'm gonna do with the spinnerbait is I'm going to burn this thing. I'm gonna burn it as fast as I can right below the surface of the water. And the big key with this bite is I don't want my blades blowing out of the water. I want them just below the surface, making that ripple, making that V-wake in the water, but not always blowing out of the water. This is something that catches some really big fish for me when the conditions are right. Now, a lot of times, speaking of those conditions, what I'm looking for typically is some sort of breeze. I need some ripple on the water, even some bigger waves at times, especially when you're fishing for smallmouth. I need some ripple, I need some wind for this bite to work well. But this is one of the best ways to actually locate fish on these giant flats. I remember doing this a lot at Lake Oneida, catching both smallmouth and largemouth, where I would target these really big flats, and I could cover a big portion of this flat by casting that bait out, burning it back to me, and locating little pods, little areas on the lake where these fish were. Now, a lot of times once you kind of catch a couple fish on this, you can actually slow down, throw a drop shot in the same exact area and kind of clean up the fish that are right there. But I've seen days out on the water where this will catch you the biggest fish on the lake. The only ones that you'll even get to hit this thing will be really, really big ones. Just try it. I'm telling you, it's a fun technique. Now, the third technique is a little bit more of an advanced technique, and it is truly one of the best ways to catch some mondo-sized bass, some giant bass, and that's by fishing a big, heavy spinnerbait on deep offshore structure and cover. You could fish this around brush piles, big stumps, or on, you know, your ledges, your points, your humps. This is a phenomenal way. Now, when you do this, you want to use, like I said, a heavy spinnerbait, because it can be hard to keep a spinnerbait down when you have a lot of these blades on there that are kind of drawing the bait up. So you want to fish with an 1.25 ounces, ounce and a half, upwards of a 2-ounce bait to really keep that bait down there in the strike zone on the bottom. A lot of times when I've done this, I like to use 2 bigger willow leaves, and this will be a number 4, 4.5, 5, some bigger willow leaves that really just mimic those bigger shad that are down there on those deep offshore structures. Basically what I'm gonna do is, once I have the line up, whether that's a stump that I'm casting to, a brush pile, a ledge, I'm gonna cast this bait up, and I'm really just kind of creep it down there on the bottom. I want the head of this bait kind of hitting and ticking the bottom. You will feel it a lot of times, and then you will absolutely get jacked by a big bass. Again, it's a really, really good way to catch some big fish. Now, when it comes to the rod and reel that I like with a spinnerbait, there's a rod that Arc makes, which is called the Hammer. And this is a 7-foot medium heavy power rod. Anytime I'm fishing a spinnerbait on those flats like we talked about, or up in the creek arms, that is the rod that I'm going to use. I think it's the perfect spinnerbait rod. I typically use it with like a 7.3-to-1 gear ratio reel and 20-pound fluorocarbon line. Now, when I am fishing that really big spinnerbait, that ounce, ounce and a half, 2-ounce spinnerbait, I'm gonna use pretty much like a flipping and pitching rod. I use a 7-foot, 6-inch, medium heavy, fast action rod. The rod I like is actually an Invoker Pro, and I'm gonna leave a link for all the equipment and everything like that down below that I like to use. Now, when I'm fishing that heavier, bigger spinnerbait deep, I actually like to slow down my gear ratio. I'll go with like a 6.2-to-1 gear ratio. That just helps to keep that big bait down there on the bottom. I know spinnerbaits are not always the first thing that we think about in the summer, but I'm telling you what, they absolutely work. If you guys enjoyed this video, please comment below, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.